Bliss and Grit is an entirely listener-supported show. Supporting us is also designed to support you through keeping the episodes rolling and also through rewards for your donation, like a Getting Started guide, a private forum, and downloadable meditations. To become a supporting member, you can visit patreon.com/bliss and grit.
Hello, beautifuls. You are listening to Bliss and Grit. I'm Vanessa Scotto, and I'll be joined soon by my dear friend and co-host, Brooke Thomas. On the show, we're talking about being on the embodied spiritual path. What does that actually mean? What is a real evolution of our lives? How do we ultimately embrace everything? All the beauty and crazy, the joys and the messes, the bliss and the grit that is a human life. Last week's episode on aliveness brought back one of our favorite questions. What if nothing in life is actually a problem? So this week, we decided to take that question and go yet again deeper. This has been an exploration for us for a while in our own lives, which is why it keeps coming back. And of course, if you've listened before, it's been an exploration in our episodes. In this one, we get into topics such as how concepts like blame, like I deserve, and fairness are states of mind that can contribute to these problematizing tendencies. How making ourselves into a problem seems like an epidemic pastime, and how you can hold the part of yourself that feels like a problem in the part of you that knows there is nothing to solve. In our modern culture that can hyper-focus on problems and solutions, this talk can be highly medicinal. If you're enjoying the show, we're always delighted when people leave reviews on iTunes or on our Facebook page, which is Bliss and Grit. You can also head over to blissandgrit.com to get the show notes, as well as to subscribe to our weekly digest of the resources we're currently loving, or to become a supporting member and get all the treatsies that we offer at patreon.com/bliss and grit. One last thing before we head into the conversation. If you know us, you know that we can sometimes curse. So if you're in mixed company, you may want to wear headphones. Okay, everyone, here we go.
Hello, Vanessa.
Hello, my darling Brooke.
All right. Let's see where we go today.
Indeed.
So something that's been very alive for me, and I know will continue to be for a long time, probably forever, but that is really, really up in a much more tangible way than it has been in the past, is this experience from time to time, not all the time, of, oh my gosh, maybe nothing is a problem. And maybe that's what we're really talking about here, is not making anything a problem. Now, when I say that on the surface, we know all the problematic systems in there, right? Like there's all kinds of bypass and, turning away from things. There's all kinds of ways that we make ourselves into the transcendental project, as John Prendergast would say. So I want to have a conversation where we can really slow down and touch into that in a way where, for me selfishly, I have a chance to kind of underline it a little and explore it. And then, for people listening, I'm curious to hear what an experience of it might feel like. So we'll see where we go. But it's on my mind a bunch. And then really just right before we started recording, I was listening to my friend Liam Bowler's podcast, The Body Awake, and he was having a conversation with Jill Miller, who has been a teacher of mine in the past, trained in Yoga Tuna with her, so I know Jill well. It was a lovely conversation. I'll link to it in the show notes. Obs. But it was so great because it pointed again at this thing that I'm thinking about a lot. So Jill has been in the yoga world and the movement educator world for decades and has been engaged as a yoga practitioner in a very dedicated and serious way since she was in her teens. And she recently had a hip replacement and has been very public about it, which I think is really courageous, which is interesting. Like that it's courageous to just say something that's true, right? Like I'm a human being who needs a hip replacement. And I am aware that probably, very high probability, I was overly aggressive with my body in yoga poses. And that's one of the reasons why this hip joint deteriorated. And they talked a little bit about this. And I would imagine, as somebody who's also been in the holistic health field for a long time, that she probably got quite a lot of celebration for being public about it and honest about it. But also quite a lot of pushback of, well, if you're a yoga teacher or a movement educator, corrective exercise specialist, any of these things, and you are injured at your own hands, you're no longer valid. You know, you're no longer good at what you do. You're no longer trusted authority. There's this way, I'm going to say in the wellness world, but in all worlds, where we want to make things dogmatic and be the ones who got it right. And we're not allowed to get it wrong. And then the other thing embedded in that inquiry and in that conversation is like, oh, well, if you could go back in time, if you had a time machine, would you not do it? You know, would you not spend a month in the jungles of Costa Rica with your teacher, spending 8 hours a day practicing in these very extreme end range poses so that you could pretzel yourself into these shapes? And the supposed answer is supposed to be, oh, yes, you know, I made a mistake and I would go back in time and I would not change it. And I loved this conversation that Liam and Jill had because they didn't do that. You know, Jill didn't go for the easy answer of like, oh, yes, I screwed up. And if I could go back in time, I would not screw up. Instead, she was like, no, you know, like I got to have this profound experience. And there's all kinds of personal wiring in her that made her called to those experiences. And it certainly informed her figuring out yoga tune-up and developing her way of working with the body. And then she was still surprised, didn't know what she didn't know, when she wound up needing a hip replacement. And now it serves for her to live that in public. So as I'm tracing the thread of that, I'm like, gosh, this is such a great example of like, we don't need to make anything a problem. Like, so let's keep this in our own personal lives here, right? And we can, if we want, extrapolate it to global things because certainly they're not separate. But I mean, just for the sake of exploration, if we can trace things in our lives where it didn't go the way we thought it was going to go, it wasn't what we wanted, it didn't work out, quote unquote, the way we had hoped or the way it's supposed to, or the way our community expects it to, or decides it's supposed to. Is that a problem? Do we need to make things a problem? And what happens when we really get a chance to live out an exploration? Because certainly we're all going to experience wishing that things went another way. I'm not advocating that we just, you know, are able to chuck that in the wastebasket, you know. But what happens when we really allow ourselves to explore the potentials when we don't get what we want, when it doesn't go the way we thought, that like maybe it's exquisitely just right.
It's like when Byron Katie says, you know how I know it was meant to happen because it did.
Right.
You know, something like that. You know how you know it's meant to happen because it did. But it takes this real level of faith and this sort of openness to experience it as such. I mean, in reality, even though you said sometimes we wish something didn't happen, and we do all have those little moments like, ooh, it would have been better if I didn't say that or do that, or if only this person didn't. Whenever I've slowed people down to say, well, would you have done something differently? Do you wish you did something differently? I'm actually surprised at how little regret we tend to feel.
Yeah.
There is a way where even the painful experiences of our lives seem to be significant and meaningful, maybe beyond our own explanation. we just know that, well, that's part of what makes up Vanessa. I mean, I would never do without my divorce. And that was agonizing. But that's part of what makes me me today, right? So there's this way that perhaps we identify with even our own pain and suffering so that we regret a lot less than we'd think. Because oftentimes we're afraid that we're going to regret something. And I'm like, ooh, it just seems like most often we don't. But I think this is a really interesting question, because it's one thing to conceptually or ideologically say, yes, right, things happen because they're meant to happen. And so if they're happening, I'm going to just, believe that, versus finding a place of genuine faith and trust where you can surrender and let go of the ego's idea of how it wanted things to go and embrace what's really up. And then not only accept it, but trust that there's a level of benevolence to it. I mean, it's kind of a big deal to ask that of ourselves in a way.
It's a huge fucking deal. And I think that that's the sticking point, is that it's very hard because we have all suffered, many of us mightily. And so it's very hard to trust that there's something loving moving through that.
Or even something with meaning or like rhythm, like as if there's some, as Rick Archer would say, divine intelligence out there orchestrating something. I mean, it's very easy to fall into nihilism and presume that what we go through is just meaningless pain.
Yeah. Or even like, it's trying to teach me a lesson pain, which I think also really misses the mark, like, oh, well, I had hubris about my whatever spending habits. And then, I learned my lesson, like, I feel like that's a very, simplistic way too. And I think that what we're getting towards is, and again, John Prendergast put this beautifully in our talk with him. And many spiritual teachers point to this, like we're doing this work, and hopefully ultimately what we do is just create more space for life to move how it wants to move, and trusting that there is an intelligence in something larger than my ideas, my thinking separate self ideas about how it should go. And that if I can do the work, and if I can trust and let life move how it wants to move, then it will serve, which is different than it will work out how I hope it works out, or that I'll be what I thought I was going to be, the impressive person, the successful person. But that these things literally, genuinely, that maybe it's about more than the treats that I want, the certain kinds of treats that I've gotten attached to. And there's something larger that it serves, which is the web, of all of us, that it serves something much bigger than, me getting my treats or me learning my lesson.
I mean, as soon as you take it out of the personal self and talk about service, it changes the whole frame that you look at something through, right? Because on a personal level, the question is, did this make me the most happy? Did this help me avoid suffering and pain and fear? Did this elevate me? We have all sorts of questions like that. And what a short run game that is. Because the moment when my heart's broken, I may not see any good whatsoever in this experience that 20 years later, I may look back upon as the best moment of my life, sort of the pivotal changing point. But through the lens of what about me, on a very personal level, you can see how easy it is to sort of fall into regret, or how could this happen? Life is unkind. Life is unfair. Life is cruel. The kinds of things we tend to hold on to in those moments. But when you think in terms of service, Well, that's where it's really interesting, because then there's this higher order. Then there's not just you, but you being like the drop in the pond, there's the whole pond. And you never can understand exactly how that drop creates ripples. Like, for example, if you and I have never been through what we went through, maybe we wouldn't be having these public conversations. And maybe us having them is creating ripples we don't even know about, where other people become drops in the ponds, right? I think we can say, I mean, research shows, but you can see it empirically, a lot of people who are trauma survivors, one of the ways they find resilience is in using what they've been through to be of service to others. Mm-hmm. So implicitly, there's something that feels good in acknowledging that we're part of the whole, and that something shifts outside even as it shifts inside, like as we heal, others heal. And that's clearly very resonant to us. But then I guess the question is, why is it so hard to believe this? I mean, it feels much better to believe that everything, we just need to trust, like it's all happening for a reason. Like Vanessa got sick from mold poisoning for a reason, and she's home, dealing with X, Y, and Z for some beautiful grand plan. I mean, that's much more lovely to believe. What's the holdup? Like, where are we getting restricted around this?
Well, I think it's at the heart of what spiritual practice is, is that trusting that there's some larger intelligence or some larger field, which is not you, so it gets to the heart of the separate self issue. As soon as we take ourselves to be the separate selves who have crafted unconsciously and in innocence identities, so that, because they learned through their conditioning, this is how this separate self can get love. This is how this separate self can get acceptance. And then it just unconsciously acts these things out. As soon as we believe that is true, and we all do mostly, it's impossible to conceive of that there's anything else. Like I was in CPR training this weekend because I have to do CPR training for my license every 2 years, with a lovely teacher who I recertify with every 2 years. So I know her pretty well, 17 years in practice. I'm not always in Connecticut, but I've done this class with her a bunch. And she's talking about in the beginning, the anatomy of the heart. And she goes, oh God, this is such a great moment. She's like, from the moment your heart first beats when you're a fetus to the last heartbeat of your life when you die, you don't even have to think about your heart in order for it to work at all. Isn't that amazing? And I was like, what? It's only amazing if you think you're in control of the world. Like that you're thinking, if you believe, as many of us do, that your thinking controls the world, then you can believe like that it's crazy that your heart doesn't need you to think about it in order for every single beat to happen. And, as a body nerd, I just want to put a little plug for the magnificence of our body. Every microsecond, there are multitudes of processes going on that don't require that we think about it. We grew ourselves as a fetus and we started before we had a fucking brain. So like there's something moving here that's a larger intelligence. But it's so funny because like those are the moments now that I hear and I'm like, well, it's only mind blowing if you think your thoughts, which fit into this container of separate self, is actually doing anything. I remember being with Kieran on retreat and she was talking about the utility of the mind and that it's great to have a mind because it's really good for putting together IKEA furniture. And it's like, if you can, it's like, it's a great tool, or as John would say, as many would say, wonderful servant, poor master. But it is not in control of life. And the evidence that it's not in control of life is everywhere. So it's just this funny misunderstanding that I think, if we go through a normal human life, it's what we take ourselves to be and how we take the world to work. And then sometimes we pop out of that and and even just for moments, I don't mean in some grand crossing an enlightenment finish line. I mean, even just these moments of seeing like, oh yeah, I don't the evidence is everywhere that we are not in control of our lives.
Sure. It's almost like the self-referencing concept Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche would talk about. And it's so easy to find us at the middle of our own circles, right? Like, so the world is revolving around me. So anything that happens is sort of this personal thing that's either for or against me. And the way that I determine that is whether I feel pleasure or pain.
Right. Do I like it? Do I not like it? Check the box.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. It feels yucky. I mean, so obviously life is happening against me is oftentimes, I think, how people experience it. I mean, I remember my mom had gotten diagnosed with cancer, and thank God she caught it really early. It was a very malignant kind of skin cancer that almost never gets caught. And she caught it at the very first stage. And it was a miracle, and they took it out and she's fine. But when she got diagnosed and her own devastation, I remember her saying something akin to, like, why me? How could this happen to me? And I know that's a very natural question, so I'm not standing in judgment of it, but really my internal response was, well, why anyone? You know, why not you? I mean, there's this thing where life is mysterious and things seem to happen, and we can't always consciously understand them. And that's the funny thing about trust and about faith, is that, you know, there's a reason why they call it blind faith, right? It's a feeling, it's a genuine feeling or experience, but it's not necessarily rationally understood.
Yeah.
Which is a very hard thing for us. And I think where we can get extra tripped up, I mean, it's hard enough to have faith that even when uncomfortable things happen in our life, like it's meant to be and it's not a problem. Like, for example, food sensitivities, like, they're not a problem. You're not a problem because you have them. Like, something as simple as that is hard for us. And then if we extrapolate on the global level, you know, our president is not a problem. You know, war is not a problem. Rape is not a problem. We start to get even more confounded.
Yeah.
I consider that to be almost like grad school level. Like, don't start there. Like, let's start the conversation.
Right, exactly. Stay closer, stay in the closer circles, and then see how it ripples out.
Yeah. So even as you're listening to this, like you had framed it in the beginning, Brooke, like, let's talk about our lives. Let's look at it through the frame. I think the best way we can practice is to practice within our own little sphere of influence, trusting that things are not a problem. So right now, I've talked about it a little bit on the show. I still get frustrated that my health's not where I want it to be. And the funny thing is, it's almost like when John Prendergast was saying in our conversation, are you willing to let something be that way forever? And I was like, oh God, I am not treating a lot of things like I'm willing for it to be there forever. So in the beginning, I was sick for a while without understanding it. And then I understood it was mold illness. And then I said, well, what a gift. It made me leave Miami and confront a lot of codependence in my family, you know, confront a lot of ways I wasn't tending to my ecosystem. Wow, what a gift. And then I was kind of sitting there impatiently tapping my foot for it to pass.
You can go now. You have given me your gifts.
Right. Like, ta-da, I've gotten it.
Right.
Lesson done. Okay. I got a B, and let's like move on from this one. And so there's this funny way that I've been observing and trying to practice, especially in listening to a lot of spiritual teachers' stories about how there was this long phase of ill health where their body wouldn't let them do anything their minds wanted to do. And I'm trying to practice trusting that this is not a problem. Because my mind, you know, one of the things I've been thinking lately, it's like, if you talk to people who are looking to create change in their life, which you do and I do, and many of you do, or you even look at your own places where you want to create change in your life, one of the things I'm noticing is it seems like the speed of the mind is a lot faster than the speed of the body and the speed of the
being. Totally. Yes. Being so your body, being the earth.
Yeah, I'm going to be like this, and I want to do like this. I'm like, why can't I get there? And like the mind can hold the picture of what it wants in lightning speed. But that's not the speed at which the body moves. And it's not the speed at which the earth moves and at which so there's this slow process that the mind is already frustrated by. And therefore already begins to lack gratitude for, already falls out of appreciation for. And I think as soon as we begin to lack gratitude for an experience, as soon as we fall out of appreciation for what it means to be human and to let something unfold in its own timing and in its own bodily way, as soon as that happens, we're already in disharmony, right? We're already in that resistance. We're certainly not willing to let it be there forever but I've got a picture in my mind.
Yeah, I have a plan. Good. This is where it's going to go. This is what I decided I want. Yeah.
Yeah. I want this to be over. And what you had said in the beginning is probably important to bring in now. This is not about getting upset about having feelings.
No.
I mean, I can certainly have whatever feelings arise, they arise because they're meant to be there too. It's more like, how are we going to hold those feelings? Like, through what container are we going to wrap ourselves around those feelings? So we can hold those feelings from the lens of separate self that says, okay, this is a problem, or I am a problem. I've got to fix it. If I don't fix it, I'm a bigger problem, and I'm not worthy of existing and being a part of this community and success and love. And like, we all know how far that spins out, right?
Yeah.
It's maybe part of the I'm unworthy ecosystem that exists within us. Or we can hold it with the part of us that already knows that this is not a problem, that we are not a problem, that life is not a problem to solve, but rather a magical mystery to experience. And from that place, when we hold the feelings, something different happens.
Yeah. I'm just thinking, for me, like, I'm really touching into, I've had to do a lot of healing from trauma, as many people listening have. And that he has this particular agonizing quality. It's so painful to turn towards those kinds of wounds. And my experience with that, as I've gone deeper on this path, or changing my orientation or my container, as you said, is that it still hurts like a motherfucker, and there's still moments where I would do almost anything to make the sensation stop. But when it's just a sensation and I can just acknowledge it, like I can kind of bow to it, nod at it, and be like, I see you. Yes. Like, and here it is again, right? Because just like you said with your health, I'll have waves of it come up, like, oh, and here it is again. But it doesn't swallow me, and it's not as sticky and compacted, because I'm not compounding this awful sensation that literally just has to be experienced. It's just what's true, is that I'm experiencing it. But I'm not compounding it with all the stories about should have, shouldn't have, I shouldn't have done that. I should have done it differently. God shouldn't have made this a part of my life story. This shouldn't happen to any human being ever. Like, all those kinds of things, actually just, in my experience, make it so much more painful, which is interesting because, of course, I think the impulse for that is self-protection. But it's self-protection in an imaginary way where we can pretend we can go back, or we can pretend we can protect and defend by leaping forward, when the reality in the present tense is that it's just being experienced, and like, I made it, it's not happening right now. This particular trauma flavor that might come up, right? Like, look, I made it out of that moment, that awful moment. And at the exact same time, it's being experienced. But once I get into should have, shouldn't have, or blame and deserve, which John does a great job of unpacking too, that it's not fair, or I deserve, it's not fair that happened to me. I deserve a better kind of life. I worked really hard. I deserved a different, personal work, worked really hard, deserved a different kind of outcome or whatever. Those are just very, very sticky phantoms, that are not true, but that serve to exacerbate the pain. So the pain doesn't have to go anywhere, but we have to expose the reality that when we get caught in should and shouldn't and blame and deserve, man, we are just pouring kerosene on the fire.
Right. Which is funny because it happens so spontaneously that no one even sees it that way. And it seems so justifiable, right? But it's not fair. I mean, what a terrible thing to happen.
Fucking
right?
sucks.
And so it
for
seems
any
like such
human.
a natural path to go down. I was picturing when you were talking, you said sometimes the pain is so agonizing and you still just wish, right, that it wouldn't be there. And I got the image of a mother with a child that's suffering.
Yeah.
Of course you would wish your child wasn't in agony. Of course you would wish that. And what would you do in the face of it? Wrap them in your arms, hug them, soothe them, rub their hair, tell them that they're going to be okay, that everything is okay, and you would rock them. And that's what you would do, right? And that child, as its head is on your heart and it's listening to your heartbeat, right? That first universal sound, and it's feeling the rocking and the soothing, may not change the circumstance, but all of a sudden something feels more tolerable. Something feels more sane. Something feels more grounded. I mean, it's so profoundly relieving just not to be alone in something. I mean, I remember one of my teachers, Sabamfu Some, who was a West African healer, was talking about how one of the biggest problems with trauma is that we're alone in it because we don't speak about it. Even in our families, how sometimes people are like, I don't want to ask. They go, I don't want to ask, I don't want it to be rude. Maybe they don't want to talk about it, all of these different things. So most people, with whatever you're suffering with, have a tendency of suffering alone. And then even within ourselves, it's like dry and dusty because we're suffering and then we're in judgment of it. And that judgment creates just a further hell realm. And there we are. And our own suffering, which is part of this human experience, part of being human, gets held in the container of judgment and blame. And it's a very agonizing reality. And if you could imagine instead holding it from a place of love and softness, it's like you're taking that pain and you're bringing it into heaven. And it can be ameliorated. It could be softened. It's a whole different thing. I really appreciated about our conversation with John. We were talking about self-love, and he made a note that when he works with people, he talks about the part that doesn't love yourself, and we can access that, the part that's unloving, the part that's judging, and then to feel into if there is a part that already does, already knows you're whole, already knows it's not a problem, already knows you're not a problem. And can you access that? And then hold the part that is in pain with the part that already knows you're whole. And what's amazing, I've been using it with clients since, and of course, always with myself. What's amazing is there's that part. Even in those of us who think we're irreparably fucked up, like we are a problem, like capital A, capital problem. Even in those people, we can feel this other part, which is truth, which is, and I'm whole and complete and perfect just as I am. And then we can take that part that's real. So it's not a figment of our imagination. We're not sort of mentally muscling our way to, okay, this is all for the better. But rather we can find the part of us that just accesses truth, that even if we can't understand it, there's a rhythm here and it's not a problem and we don't have to make it one, and we are not a problem, most importantly. And we could wrap it around in that blanket of warmth. And what a difference that makes.
And I want to bring it in a little bit more even to what you touched on there. Like, well, what if nothing's a problem? What might it look like to do something other than the easy bypass, bright side, right? Silver lining. Because I think that's at best oversimplified approach to our own experience, and at worst harmful, where we really tourniquet parts of ourselves. So I think about Byron Katie again. She had this great way she was talking about, I think, in dating or relationships, like if there's somebody you really want to be with and they reject you, they don't want to be with you, they don't want to be your partner, that 100% of the time you have been spared. And I remember reading that many years ago. Byron Katie's been with me for over a decade now. And just be like, no, but, kind of internally, or no, but I want it to go a certain way. And
it's just because I'm the worst. There's that other voice that goes, right? Like,
sure,
I would have had that love if I wasn't the worst.
If I hadn't fucked it up, right? And if I wasn't the worst, and if I wasn't unlovable, and if I wasn't unworthy. And I think we can take that idea, you have been spared, and we can apply it in all categories, not just love and relationships. Like if something doesn't go the way we want, or if something, that say somebody wouldn't sign up for themselves, like trauma, comes your way, as it does for so many of us. I would say most of us. Then how have we been spared? Right? So like this is a harder look, master's level. So if I've been profoundly traumatized by something, I could bright side it, right? Like, isn't it such great news that I have experienced healing from trauma? And isn't it such great news that I have an appreciation for what's on the leading edge of trauma recovery, and that I get to have these conversations in public and let other people know they're not alone, and that, I get to heal in public and all these things. And all of these things are true and sacred to me. So I'm not trying to belittle them. But if I stop there, I lose some of the deep juice, And so it's like, what are some of the ways, I'm really going into tricky territory at the end of the call here. What are some of the ways that by having been the traumatized one, the one who experienced those things, what was I spared? And honestly, there's a way that we can skip over the surface of this and create more pain for ourselves, right? Isn't it great news that I'm the one that got to have the hard life? Right? Which is like just not helpful. Doesn't feel good in the system. But on the other hand, if I zoom out and I look at my life and I go deeper than just isn't it great that I understand trauma recovery? There is a depth of my life. There is a knowing of life. There is a call and experience of not being able to sleepwalk because I was bitch slapped so hard that sleepwalking was no longer an option. And so the skim the surface is like, isn't that great? I learned a lesson. The depthful thing is like, I have been spared. I have been spared a life of sleepwalking. That is a big fucking deal. Like that I get to be here and really be here is the kingdom of heaven on earth, quite literally. That is the most loving gift that I could ever receive. And I got that courtesy of my friend, trauma recovery, and trauma in general. So I think that, we don't have to all look at the hardest aspects of ourselves and ask that question. It's just fun and interesting for me to do it for myself. But in any realm of our lives where we are in all of our beautiful humanness tempted to, it's not fair, I deserve, ask, how have I been spared? Or if I even take something much, much lighter, I have had so many ideas about how my worldly success was going to go and was going to look. I'm a maker, I'm entrepreneurial, and in my, younger years, but I would say in particular about a decade ago, it was going to look a certain way. I was going to build a certain business. I was going to grow a certain income. I was going to be impressive. I was going to be the impressive one. It did not go that way. And it did not go that way so many times through so many different projects. And that humbling over and over and over again has brought me to, I lost those imagined successes, but I was spared a life of mediocrity. I was spared of a very surface experience of success and identifying as the impressive one. And instead, I've been granted this very deep inquiry into my humanness and permission to be human, and then permission for all of us, and my work winds up being about the whole human family getting a chance to be human. I would not trade that for like some fancy successful business where I got to check the impressive one, pulled it off box. I would not trade that. So I was spared,
Well, at a deep level, and it makes perfect sense to me, I guess it's hard to sometimes access that level of reality until you access the beauty of being present and alive.
Yeah.
So as we're stuck in our own constrictions around I'm a problem or blame or unfair or judgment, it's much more difficult to experience the beauty of presence and your aliveness that you're speaking about. And then unfortunately, life can feel a bit like a long-term desert, and we can go through trauma, especially if it happens early on in your life. And we keep imagining that life should get better because that would be the fair thing, right? Like I went through real mad shit, but, then it's going to be better on the other side. And then it doesn't. And it's really confounding because that seems not fair. And we keep getting spun out into that web, which would be interesting to imagine, like, what would happen if we softened our gaze on this in the way that you're describing and looked at it through another level. The funny thing I was thinking of when you were talking, and remind me to bring culture into this if I forget, because I have another point. But while you were talking, I was thinking about myself when I first went to therapy in my 20s. And I was speaking to my Hakomi therapist, and I was speaking about my childhood. And see, I'm going to say it even now. I didn't have the worst childhood. This is the way people who've been through trauma couch trauma, right? And that was basically what I was saying to the therapist, and it wasn't the worst childhood. People have been through much worse, but it was very significantly traumatizing to me, regardless. And I remember, it's not like I was locked in a closet and I wasn't raped and I wasn't, so how could I feel all these feelings? What a baby I am, right? And that's the funny thing. A lot of people who have some level of trauma, especially if it's not as overt as like those capital T traumas we're all aware of, if it's more covert, subtle verbal trauma, mild levels of aggression, the first thing they do is actually make their childhood not a problem. Oh, that wasn't a problem. And what they have to do to have that make any level of sense is, I'm a problem. That wasn't a problem. I am a problem. I shouldn't feel this way. I shouldn't be reacting to that. I mean, most humans have it worse in life. What's the matter with me? So there's this other really interesting thing that I guess as we explore this and we aim to look at what if nothing in my life is a problem, we can't then grapple on with the other hand that says, well, I'm just a problem for thinking it's a problem, right?
Yes.
Like there's this
yes, that little party trick will come right on in for sure.
Well, HSPs, that's what so many HSPs do this because of their level of self-reflectiveness. It goes, well, that wasn't a problem. It's almost like you do have some level of contact with reality that says, listen, everyone was just doing their best and things are meant to happen. It's like you sort of can grasp the edges of truth. But since you still don't have that way of sitting with oneness, you go, well, then how does this make any sense? And you go, well, I guess the way it makes sense is I'm a problem for thinking it's a problem or for having experienced it as problematic. And then you just rest there. You spend the rest of your life.
And I would say mostly unconsciously, that the way we tell ourselves stories about how we're a problem happens below the radar almost always. Sometimes it'll peek up above over the surface and we'll catch a little glimpse, but it's not a conscious construction.
Right. So as you're playing with this level of reality that we're sharing, try not to let go with one hand and grab on with the other.
And the hands will want to grab whatever they can grab.
The moment you try to release, I'm a problem, you go, oh my God, they're a problem, right? Yeah. And the moment you're trying to release, like, life is a problem, you go, oh my God, I'm a problem. And so really soft and really, what if, like, giant question mark, what if nothing was a problem? I mean, that's the level at which we're having this conversation. And I just wanted to add about culture that I think one of the giant compounding problems is how oriented our culture is to making you a problem or making something a problem. I mean, if you have an individual experience, let's just say, for example, you are a sensitive child, and let's say you grew up in a household with 3 children and you are the only sensitive child. Well, right away, your feelings become problematized. How could you feel that way? You must be a problem. God forbid you have a food sensitivity and you go to a restaurant and you ask for substitutions. You're the problem person in the group, right? And these levels at which culture treats individualism and individual experience. I mean, I was listening to this guy this morning. It's why this is like top of mind to talk about sensitivity. And he was giving a talk about highly sensitive people and how in some cultures, they actually have reverence for highly sensitive people. You're actually more popular. And I forget what he was pointing to. I want to say it was something like Thailand and India. But in the United States and in Canada, probably other cultures he hadn't studied, if you're highly sensitive, you're a problem, which is true, right? Obviously, none are true. Obviously, if true is true, and true is true across cultures, right? The true is true as we span the whole globe. Yet, to grow up within a family unit or to grow up within a paradigm or a cultural system that has a tendency of thinking along the lines of fair, unfair, deserving and undeserving, right and wrong, problem or not. It's so hard to kind of shake the cultural veil. Like, when I was sick, I can't say how many people were, because it wouldn't show up on a blood test, said I must have a problem, a mental problem. I'm like, no one chooses this for themselves. And do I seem mentally unsound? Now, I'm not saying that we're not complex mysteries and that there's not always a level of physical, psychological, spiritual. I'm just pointing to this massive cultural paradigm where we want things to be landed, sort of, as we were saying, like, what was that group of people, the lifestyle people on social media?
Oh, so, female lifestyle empowerment brands.
Yes. Right.
Yes.
Like, want people
Kelly Deals is the woman who points that out in a beautiful way.
And period, right? Like, I can't say how many people write on social media, like, I finally love myself, period. And I know they're like 25 still. And I'm like,
you're probably going to go through some iterations. Yeah.
Yeah. It's just the way that it works. Is there's so many different peeling backs of what this means, right? But we wish there could be this period.
Yeah.
And if you don't have a period at the end of the sentence, we're like, ugh, you're still dealing with problems? Well, that kind of makes you problematic, and I'm not into problems. I'm into solutions.
Yeah.
Period.
And you're pointing at the whole giant system we all sit right underneath called capitalism. The whole fucking way it exists is there's a problem. I have the answer. Give me money for it. And so you just see it play out because it is the air we breathe. It's the cultural veil that is so, so dense. And so even when we're trying to do work in the wellness world, we're trying to bring health and healing and light to people, we do it in this is the problem. I have the answer. Look at me. There's a period at the end of my sentence. I figured it out. give me money for it, and so like we have to just, expose that too so that we can catch the whiff of it because it's everywhere all the time. But it keeps alive in our personal, spiritual, and psychological structures, this idea that there must be problems.
Yeah. I mean, we're so plugged into the collective. It's a delusion to imagine you're stepping outside of it very easily. Of course, we can access outside of the collective, but it can be so dense. I think it's part of the reason why people used to go on private retreat or go into the mountains or do dark retreat like Reggie Ray does, or all of these different things, because it's almost like when we're talking at this spiritual level, we're talking about seeing with new eyes.
Yes.
Right? Like we're talking about dimension hopping into a different dimension of reality where we're capable of seeing things as not a problem. And it's very hard to dimension hop and see with new eyes and hear with new ears and all of these different experiences when the collective is so densely pouring information at you, right? It's like a whole different level of faith because we're wired to see the world the way our tribe does. I mean, we don't want that aberrance. We're wired to try not to be aberrant. That's sort of the survival operating system is wired against that. So we're all kind of sitting in the soup on one level or another. Some of you blessedly not as much, and some of us very densely, depending on the culture and family system we're a part of, that wants to say there's a problem somewhere. So it's either you or it's others or it's life. Find it, make it better. And if you don't, you're a whiner, you're a complainer, and definitely you're the problem.
You're a failure. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, and you've got about 6 months to get to that.
6 months is a very long amount of time for the mind's schedule. That's a very generous.
It's like within the scope. Like I remember getting divorced, and when I was 33, and not many of my friends had been divorced at the time. And I remember asking my sister who had been, and I was like, so how long till I feel better? Right. Tapping
when
my
does
foot
this part go away?
And like, sweet me. I mean, I was desperate. I get why I asked it. And she said something like, oh, I think I started to feel more normal about 5 years after. And I was like, what?
I know.
5 years? That's bullshit.
Right.
And it felt like someone was giving me, a life sentence or something. And of course, actually, in the scope of existence, it really isn't such a big deal. It wasn't such a big deal. It was like every day with every breath, there was a different moment. There was a different possibility. There was a different access. Things were changing. And it's only when you're through it that you look back and you even see time. I mean, time is irrelevant as you're in the process. But recently I was talking to someone who had Lyme disease, and she's very physically active. She's like my model of recovery, even though she still has a lot of sensitive issues. But I'm like, so how long did it take you before you really started to feel better? And she was like, I think about 4 years. And I was like, okay. I can have this whole different experience. And I understand my experience is different, but it's so lovely to see possibility in the world around us. And I could finally hold that, like 4 years, it's the drop in the bucket.
And those 4 years are blessed years. They're not throwaway years. Like, why do we always have to have the question of what's the finish line I get to cross? And I get that we all do it, including me, obviously. And it's such a sweet impulse, but we can relieve some of our suffering by just noticing that we keep putting down finish lines. Right. And just saying, well, maybe there isn't one, and just a little, it actually softens things. It sounds like the worst fucking thing in the world to the separate self, but it actually softens things.
And what if there's value in everything? Yeah. I mean, this is sort of what we were talking about in our episode on aliveness last week. It's like, why can't we just value the whole shebang? Mm-hmm. Right? Because if value is only placed on the moments where we feel we've arrived, it's a shitty existence. Exactly.
Because all we want is those ideas of how it's going to go one day eventually, which is never fucking now.
Right. Because you know what always happens to us? We land somewhere we think we wanted to be. wherever it is, we get married, we get a job,
we have the baby,
finally we land there. And even there seems to be something that is a growing edge, we might say, just to be like,
just a little
psychology.
bit. Yeah.
But like there's some shitstorm that you're not satisfied with, or you're not happy about, or it's not how you thought it was going to be, or my God, you still feel deficient, or, it's nice, but now this level of responsibility, has you not sleeping at night. Like whatever, doesn't matter. It's just the point is there's nowhere we land. I was listening to a back app podcast this morning with a woman named Joy Sharp, and her and Rick were talking about actually the Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche quote we always use, but he didn't quote right. He thought it was someone in like the Vedic traditions, but like the bad news is your fault.
Yeah.
The bad news is you're falling through air. The good news is there's no ground. Right. And Rick was quoting that, and Joy was talking about how her favorite quote from Jesus Christ was, "The Son of Man has no place to rest his head." Mm. And it's, the same thing, this groundlessness. So we keep expecting there's a place to land where there won't be any problems. But like,
maybe it's just a crazy cuckoo idea and we can eventually let go of it. And then what?
Maybe it's just that we stop relating to life as a problem. And that's the nirvana.
Yeah.
Thanks for listening to today's show. The show notes, including any resources we mentioned, live at blissandgrit.com. Just pop over to the website and scroll down, and you'll see each episode's separate post. We put the resources right in there. Our member platform is at Patreon, patreon.com/blissandgrit. You can head there to donate to the show and also to get amazing rewards for your support. If you're wanting to engage with these topics in a deeper way, that's a great place to go for a more immersive experience with both of us. You can also come chat with us on Instagram and Facebook, or subscribe to the newsletter on the website, which is blissandgrit.com. Many of you have also written kind reviews, which we are always so grateful for. Here is one from Barb Schmidt, who said, "I've listened to Brooke's podcast for a long time and really enjoyed her deep, big into embodiment. I was a little unsure about listening to this podcast, but listened today to episode 41. Wow, she and Vanessa really open you up to energy in a way that you just need to know more and more." Thanks so much for that, Barb. Thanks to all of you who've taken a moment to write us reviews, and we'll be back next week.